The frosty Montana wind howled mercilessly against the cabin walls as Faith Keller stoked the dying embers of her hearth, her hands trembling not from the cold, but from the weight of the gilded photograph frame she'd placed beside her rocking chair. The image of her husband, Thomas, smiled back at her, eternally youthful, eternally brave in his Union Army uniform, taken just days before he'd marched off to what would become his final battle. 3 years had passed since the telegram arrived, but the pain remained as fresh as yesterday's tears. Faith pulled her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders, the cabin suddenly feeling impossibly empty, despite the modest furnishings she'd managed to maintain since Thomas's death. At 26, she found herself a widow in a land that showed little mercy to women alone. The small ranch Thomas had purchased with such optimism was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain, and the brutal winter of 1871 threatened to be her undoing. A sharp knock at the door startled her from her memories. Faith quickly wiped away an errant tear, tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear, and cautiously approached the entrance. Visitors were rare in this remote stretch of Montana territory, especially during the bitter months of winter. "Who's there?" she called, her voice stronger than she felt. "Madam, it's just a traveler seeking shelter from this storm," came the reply, deep and weathered but not unkind. "My horse is about done in, and I spotted your chimney smoke. I can pay for lodging or work for it if you prefer." Faith hesitated. Thomas would have welcomed the stranger without question. But Thomas was gone, and Faith had learned caution in his absence. Still, turning someone away in such weather was as good as a death sentence. "I have a rifle," she warned, reaching for the Winchester that hung above the mantel. "And I know how to use it." A low chuckle sounded through the door. "I'd expect nothing less, madam." When Faith finally unbolted the door, she was met with the sight of a tall figure, snow-dusted and wind-battered. He removed his hat immediately, revealing dark hair streaked with premature silver at the temples. His face was tanned and lined from years under the sun, but his eyes, a startling shade of blue, held no malice. "Name's Killian York," he said, extending a gloved hand. "Obliged for the shelter." Faith nodded, but didn't take his hand. "Faith Keller, there's a stable around back for your horse. You can have the floor by the fire for the night. Come morning, you'll be on your way." "Fair enough," Killian replied, replacing his hat. "I'll tend to my horse first, if that's all right." Faith watched from the doorway as he led his exhausted mount toward the small stable. There was something in his bearing, a quiet dignity despite his trail-worn appearance that reminded her of Thomas. The comparison made her heart ache anew. When Killian returned, stomping snow from his boots, Faith had already placed a pot of stew over the fire and laid out a simple bedroll near the hearth. She gestured toward it wordlessly, then returned to her rocking chair, picking up her mending to keep her hands busy and her eyes averted. Killian removed his heavy coat and settled near the fire, extending his hands toward the warmth. His gaze wandered around the modest cabin, taking in the sparse furnishings, the patched curtains, and finally settling on the photograph beside Faith's chair. "Your husband?" he asked softly. Faith's hands stilled. "Yes." "Army man?" "Union. Died at Spotsylvania Courthouse." Killian nodded solemnly. "I was there. Different side of the line, though." Faith's eyes snapped to his face, searching for signs of mockery or hostility, but found only a shared understanding of loss. "He looks like a good man," Killian said, nodding toward the photograph. The simple observation, so plainly stated, broke something loose inside Faith. "He was," she whispered, her voice catching. "The very best of men." Killian didn't press further, seeming to understand that some wounds were still too raw for careless prodding. Instead, he accepted the bowl of stew she offered with genuine gratitude, and they ate in companionable silence as the storm raged outside. Faith studied him surreptitiously as they ate. His hands were calloused but clean, his movements deliberate and measured. When he thought she wasn't looking, his expression revealed a weariness that went beyond physical exhaustion. "Where are you headed?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. "Nowhere in particular," Killian admitted. "Drifting since the war. Tried my hand at ranching in Wyoming for a spell, but it didn't take. Now I'm just following work where I can find it." "Not much work to be found in these parts this time of year," Faith observed. Killian's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "I've noticed." Another silence fell. broken only by the crackling of the fire and the howling wind. Faith rose to clear away their dishes, acutely aware of the stranger's presence in her home, the first man to share her hearth since Thomas. "I appreciate the hospitality, Mrs. Keller," Killian said quietly. "I know it can't be easy, taking in a stranger." Faith paused, her back to him. "No, it isn't, but neither is freezing to death." "Fair point." She heard the smile in his voice. "Still, thank you." Faith nodded without turning, unwilling to acknowledge the unexpected comfort of another human voice in her too quiet home. "Get some rest, Mr. York. Morning comes early here." The storm showed no signs of abating by dawn, and Faith found herself offering Killian breakfast and another night's shelter before she'd fully thought it through. He accepted with obvious relief, then immediately offered to earn his keep. "Ranch this size. There must be repairs needing done," he observed. "I'm handy with tools, and this weather's perfect for indoor work." Faith hesitated, then led him to the leaking corner of the cabin where water damage had weakened the logs. "Thomas was planning to fix this before—" She trailed off, unable to complete the thought. Killian nodded, understanding without words. "I can handle it? Got any spare timber?" By midday, Killian had not only repaired the leaking corner, but had also fixed 3 broken chair legs, a stubborn door hinge, and was working on reinforcing the sagging shelf in Faith's small pantry. She found herself watching his capable hands, the way he approached each task methodically, the quiet concentration in his expression. "Where did you learn carpentry?" she asked, as she placed a cup of coffee near his elbow. "My father was a furniture maker before the war," Killian answered, carefully measuring a piece of wood. "I spent my boyhood in his workshop in Tennessee. Never had his true gift for it, but he made sure I knew my way around tools." "And then the war came," Faith said softly. Killian's hands stilled momentarily. "Yes, madam, the war came, and everything changed." That evening, as another fierce snowstorm descended upon the Montana wilderness, Faith found herself sharing stories about Thomas. Little things she hadn't spoken of since his passing. How he'd proposed to her beneath a maple tree in her father's yard. How he'd taught himself to dance before their wedding, stepping on her toes despite his efforts. How he'd dreamed of building a cattle empire in the West. "He sounds like he deserved better than what fate gave him," Killian observed, his voice gentle. "We all deserve better than what fate gives us, Mr. York," Faith replied, her fingers tracing the edge of Thomas's photograph. "But we make do with what we have. That we do, Mrs. Keller, that we do." One night of shelter became 2, then 3, as the storm continued unabated. Faith discovered that Killian was a surprisingly good cook, having learned from necessity during his years of drifting. He told her stories of his travels of the Grand Canyon at sunset, of wild mustangs running free in Nevada, of the Pacific Ocean's vastness, painting pictures with words that transported Faith beyond the confines of her isolated existence. On the 4th night, as they sat before the fire, Killian finally asked the question that had been hovering unspoken between them. "How do you manage this place alone, Mrs. Keller?" Faith sighed, setting aside her mending. "Not very well, if I'm being honest. Thomas had plans for cattle, but I've only managed to keep a few head, some chickens, and a vegetable garden in summer. It's enough to survive, but not to thrive." She hesitated, then added, "The bank in town has been suggesting I sell." "And will you?" Faith's gaze drifted to Thomas's photograph. This land was his dream. Selling it feels like losing him all over again. Killian nodded, understanding in his eyes. Dreams can be powerful anchors. "Or chains," Faith whispered, voicing a thought she'd never dared speak aloud. The storm finally broke on the 5th day, revealing a world transformed by snow. The morning sun glittered across unblemished white fields, and the sky stretched vast and blue above the distant mountains. It was breathtaking in its beauty and isolation. Faith found Killian at the stable, preparing his horse for departure. A strange hollowness formed in her chest at the sight, though she chided herself for such foolishness. He had always been leaving. That had been clear from the start. "The path should be clear enough now," she said, forcing brightness into her voice. "You'll want to reach Dixon's Creek before nightfall." Killian turned, his expression unreadable. "Mrs. Keller, Faith, I've been thinking." Something in his tone made her heart quicken despite herself. "I'm not much for charity," he continued carefully, "but I am in need of steady work, and you're in need of an extra pair of hands. I could stay on through winter as a hired hand, nothing more. Help with repairs, the livestock, whatever needs doing. Come spring, if you still want me gone, I'll ride out without argument." Faith stared at him, surprised by the offer and by her own immediate desire to accept it. But caution made her hesitate. "Why would you want to stay? This isn't exactly a prosperous operation." Killian's gaze was direct, honest. "I've been drifting a long time, Mrs. Keller. Too long, maybe, these past days. Having purpose again, being useful." He shrugged, leaving the thought unfinished. "I can sleep in the stable, keep to myself when you want privacy." Faith considered his offer, weighing practicality against propriety. A single woman with a male employee living on her property would certainly raise eyebrows if anyone knew, but her nearest neighbors were miles away, and winter would keep visitors at bay for months yet. "The stable is too cold," she finally said. "There's a small storeroom off the kitchen that could be made habitable, but I can't pay much beyond room and board, at least not until spring." Relief and something like happiness transformed Killian's weathered face. "That's more than fair." The arrangement proved beneficial almost immediately. Killian's knowledge of ranching far exceeded Faith's, and under his guidance, they implemented systems to make the daily chores more efficient. He repaired fences that Faith had been forced to neglect, reinforced the stable roof, and built storage solutions that made the cabin feel more spacious despite the addition of another person. January melted into February, and Faith found herself adapting to Killian's presence with surprising ease. He was unfailingly respectful of her privacy, retiring to his small room early each evening and emerging only after he heard her moving about in the morning. Their days fell into a comfortable rhythm of shared work and quiet conversations by the fire. One evening, as a particularly fierce blizzard descended on the valley, Faith found herself sharing the story of how she and Thomas had met at a church social in Illinois. "I was 17 and thought myself quite sophisticated," she recalled with a small smile. "Thomas was 22 and so earnest it was almost painful to watch. He stepped on my dress during our first dance and was so mortified he couldn't look me in the eye for the rest of the evening." Killian chuckled. "And yet, you married him?" Faith's smile deepened. "He sent me wildflowers every day for a week afterward, with little notes apologizing for his clumsiness. By the third day I was completely charmed. We were married 6 months later, just before he enlisted." "How long did you have together?" Killian asked gently. 3 years, though most of that time he was away fighting." Faith's fingers traced the edge of Thomas's photograph, a habit she'd developed over the years. "We had 10 days together after our wedding, then 3 precious weeks during a furlough in '63. He came home for good in a pine box." Killian's expression tightened with shared pain. "I'm sorry, Faith." "What about you?" she asked, suddenly curious. "Was there ever someone special?" A shadow passed over Killian's face. "Once. Her name was Eleanor. We were to be married after the harvest in '61, but then Fort Sumter happened, and I joined up with the Tennessee Volunteers. She wrote faithfully at first, then the letters stopped coming." "What happened?" Faith asked softly. "Typhoid took her in '62. Her mother wrote to tell me, but the letter didn't reach me until months later." He stared into the fire, lost in memory. "By then, I'd already seen so much death, it almost didn't feel real. I couldn't grieve properly until after Appomattox." Faith reached across the space between them and briefly touched his hand the first time she had voluntarily made physical contact with him. "I'm sorry, Killian." He looked up, surprise flickering in his eyes at the use of his given name, then offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. It was a lifetime ago, but they both knew some wounds never fully healed, only scarred over. As February turned to March, the harshest edge of winter began to soften. The days grew perceptibly longer, and occasionally the temperature rose enough to partially melt the snow before freezing again at night. Faith's hens began laying more regularly, and one of her cows delivered a healthy calf that Killian helped bring safely into the world. Faith found herself watching Killian more often, the way sunlight caught in his dark hair as he worked outside, the gentle patience he showed with the animals, the quiet strength in his hands. She caught herself wondering what it would be like to be held in those hands, then blushed furiously at her own thoughts. Thomas had been gone barely 3 years, and here she was, noticing another man's hands. One evening, as they finished a simple supper of rabbit stew, Killian cleared his throat nervously. "I've been thinking, Faith, about your situation here." Faith tensed, suddenly afraid he was preparing to leave now that spring was approaching. "This land has good potential," he continued, oblivious to her anxiety. "But cattle ranching requires more capital than you currently have. Have you considered sheep instead?" Faith blinked, caught off guard by the unexpected direction. "Sheep?" Killian nodded, enthusiasm lighting his features. "They require less land than cattle, are hardier in this climate, and produce wool as well as meat. The initial investment is lower, and you'd see returns faster. But sheep and cattle ranchers are at odds everywhere in the territories," Faith pointed out. "We'd make enemies of our neighbors." Killian leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Your nearest cattle neighbor is 15 miles away, and this valley is naturally bounded by the mountains. It's perfect terrain for sheep." As Killian outlined his vision, Faith found herself captivated not just by the practical logic of his plan, but by his passion for it, and by the repeated use of "we" when discussing the future. It had been so long since Faith had allowed herself to think beyond mere survival, to consider the possibility of building something lasting. "It sounds promising," she admitted when he finished. "But where would we get the money for even a small flock?" Killian hesitated, then reached into his shirt pocket and withdrew a small leather pouch. "I've been saving. It's not much, but it's enough for a start, maybe 20 good ewes and a ram or two." Faith stared at the pouch, then at Killian. "You'd invest your savings in my ranch?" "In our future," Killian corrected, then immediately looked chagrined. "I mean, I'm not presuming anything, Faith. I've found purpose here. I'd like to stay if you'll have me, as a partner in the business, if nothing else." Faith's heart raced at the implications of his words, at the naked hope in his eyes. "I need time to think," she said softly. Killian nodded, carefully returning the pouch to his pocket. "Of course, there's no rush." But both knew that spring would soon demand decisions. That night, Faith lay awake long after retiring to her bedroom, her thoughts in turmoil. The logical part of her mind recognized the sound business sense in Killian's proposal. The ranch needed more than one person to thrive, and Killian had proven himself hard-working, knowledgeable, and trustworthy. But it wasn't just the business arrangement that kept her awake. It was the way her pulse quickened when their hands accidentally touched passing tools between them. The way she found herself looking forward to their evening conversations by the fire. The way his rare, full smile made something long dormant inside her stir to life. Faith turned toward her small bedside table where Thomas's photograph stood. "What would you have me do?" she whispered to the silent image. "You wanted me to be happy. You said so before you left. But how can I be happy without betraying your memory?" No answer came, only the quiet creaking of the cabin settling in the cold night. The next morning brought a surprise visitor, Pastor Miller, from the small church in the nearest town, making his rounds to check on isolated parishioners after the long winter. Faith hurriedly introduced Killian as her hired ranch hand, but the pastor's raised eyebrow made it clear he understood the potential impropriety of the situation. "Mrs. Keller, might I have a private word?" the pastor asked after accepting a cup of coffee. Killian immediately excused himself to tend to the animals, leaving Faith alone with the pastor's gentle but unmistakable concern. "I mean no disrespect," Pastor Miller said once they were alone, "but I must consider your reputation, my dear. A young widow living alone with a man not related to her." "Mr. York has been a perfect gentleman," Faith interrupted, heat rising in her cheeks. "He saved this ranch from ruin this winter. I don't doubt his character or contributions," the pastor assured her, "but others might not be so understanding. The Bible teaches us to avoid even the appearance of evil." Faith bristled at the implication. "There is nothing evil in an honest working arrangement, Pastor." Pastor Miller sighed, his kind eyes sympathetic. "Of course not, but the world is quick to judge, especially women in your position. If Mr. York intends to stay on, perhaps it would be wise to consider making the arrangement more conventional." Faith stared at him, suddenly understanding his meaning. "You're suggesting marriage." It would protect your reputation and secure your future, he pointed out gently. And from what little I've observed, there seems to be mutual respect between you. Many successful marriages have been built on less. After the pastor departed, promising to return in a few weeks, Faith found herself walking the snowy path to the small family plot where Thomas was buried. She knelt beside the simple wooden cross, brushing snow from its surface. "I don't know what to do," she confessed to the silent grave. "Killian is a good man. He reminds me of you sometimes, your kindness, your determination. I think I could care for him, given time." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I think perhaps I already do. But loving him feels like losing you all over again." The only answer was the whisper of wind through the bare branches overhead. When Faith returned to the cabin, she found Killian splitting firewood with focused precision, his breath clouding in the cold air. He paused when he saw her, leaning on the axe handle. "Everything all right with the pastor?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Faith took a deep breath. "He thinks we should marry." Killian's expression froze, the axe nearly slipping from his grip. "I see." He carefully set the tool aside and turned to face her fully. "And what do you think?" "I think it's not a decision to be made based on other people's expectations," Faith replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "Marriage should be more than a practical arrangement." Something like disappointment flickered in Killian's eyes before he carefully masked it. "I agree completely, but," Faith continued, her heart pounding, "I also think the pastor is right about some things. If we're to build this ranch together, try your idea with the sheep, we should do it properly. As partners in every sense." Hope dawned cautiously on Killian's face. "Faith, are you saying—" "I'm saying I'm not ready to marry again. Not yet." She took a step toward him. "But I'm also saying I'd like you to stay. I'd like us to see where this might lead, given time." Killian closed the distance between them, stopping just short of touching her. "I would never rush you, Faith, and I would never try to replace what you had with Thomas. But I care for you more than I thought possible after Eleanor. If you'll give me a chance, I'll spend every day trying to be worthy of your trust." Faith reached up tentatively, her fingertips brushing his weather-roughened cheek. "We'll start with sheep," she said with a small smile, "and see where it leads." The transformation of the Keller Ranch began with the arrival of 30 merino sheep in early April, 25 ewes, most of them pregnant, and 5 robust rams. The initial outlay depleted Killian's savings and most of Faith's emergency funds, but as the snow fully retreated and the first wildflowers pushed through the thawing earth, hope took root alongside them. Faith discovered that Killian's knowledge of sheep ranching stemmed from a brief period working for a Welsh immigrant in Colorado. Together, they cleared additional pasture land, constructed simple shelters, and prepared for the lambing season. The work was exhausting, but satisfying, and Faith found herself laughing more than she had in years. Their relationship evolved cautiously, like the tentative green shoots emerging in Faith's dormant garden. Killian moved his few possessions from the storeroom to the small bunkhouse they constructed a respectable distance from the main cabin. The separation maintained propriety, while acknowledging the deepening connection between them. The first time Killian kissed her was after a particularly successful day when 3 ewes delivered healthy lambs without complications. They had worked side by side through the night, their sleeves rolled up, hands bloodied but triumphant, as new life entered the world. Dawn was breaking as they walked back to the cabin, exhausted but elated. Faith had turned to say something about breakfast when Killian's expression stopped her, a look of such tender admiration it took her breath away. He'd reached up slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back, and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You're remarkable," he'd said simply, then leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, and briefer than either of them wanted. When he pulled back, uncertainty clouded his features. "I'm sorry if that was presumptuous." Faith had answered by rising on tiptoe and returning the kiss with greater certainty, her hands resting lightly on his chest. When they finally parted, both were breathless and smiling. "Not presumptuous," she assured him, "just overdue." As spring fully blossomed into summer, so too did their relationship. They worked from sunrise to sunset, building the foundation of what they both hoped would become a prosperous sheep ranch. In the evenings, they often walked together along the creek that bordered the property, talking of their pasts and cautiously planning a future. Faith learned that Killian had been the eldest of 4 children, that he'd had ambitions of becoming an architect before the war, that he played the harmonica beautifully, but only when he thought no one was listening. She shared her own dreams of the children she'd hoped to have with Thomas, of the flower garden she'd always wanted to plant but never had time for, of her secret desire to learn to paint. One warm evening in July, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies rise from the tall grass, Killian took her hand and placed a small object in her palm. Faith looked down to find a simple silver ring with a small pearl set in the center. "It was my mother's," Killian explained, his voice unusually nervous. "I've carried it with me since she passed, waiting for the right moment, the right person." Faith stared at the ring, emotion welling in her throat. "I'm not asking for an answer now," Killian continued hastily. "I know you're still finding your way forward, still honoring what you had with Thomas. But I wanted you to know that whenever you're ready, if you're ever ready, I'll be here." Faith closed her fingers around the ring, then leaned her head against Killian's shoulder. "Keep it safe for me," she said softly. I think I might be ready sooner than either of us expected." 2 weeks later, Pastor Miller returned as promised. This time, he found Faith and Killian working together in the newly expanded garden, their easy companionship evident in every interaction. Faith invited him to stay for dinner, and as they enjoyed a simple meal of roast lamb and fresh vegetables, she explained their partnership in the sheep venture. "It seems you found a solution to your situation," the pastor observed, his eyes twinkling as he noted their obvious affection. "We're taking things one day at a time," Faith replied, exchanging a warm glance with Killian. "But yes, I believe we have." After dinner, while Faith cleared the dishes, Killian walked the pastor to his wagon and had a brief private conversation. When he returned, his expression was a mixture of nervousness and resolve. "What were you and Pastor Miller discussing so seriously?" Faith asked as they washed dishes side by side. Killian dried a plate with methodical care before answering. "I asked if he might be available to perform a wedding ceremony, should the occasion arise." Faith's hands stilled in the dishwater, her heart suddenly racing. "And what did he say?" "He said he'd be honored, and that the second Sunday in August would suit him well." Killian set down the plate and turned to face her. "But he also said that's entirely dependent on the bride's wishes." Faith dried her hands slowly on her apron, gathering her courage. "Killian, would you bring me Thomas's photograph from beside my chair?" Confusion flickered across his face, but he did as she asked, carefully retrieving the gilded frame and bringing it to her. Faith took the photograph in her hands, studying the familiar, beloved face. "I've been talking to him about you," she admitted softly. "In my head, by his grave, asking for a sign that it's all right to move forward." Killian remained silent, understanding the importance of this moment. Faith ran her finger along the edge of the frame, then looked up at Killian with clear eyes. "Thomas would have liked you. He valued honesty, hard work, and kindness above all else. He saw those qualities in me, and I see them in you." She took a deep breath. "I'll always love him, but I've realized that loving him doesn't mean I can't also love you." Hope dawned in Killian's eyes. "Faith, are you saying—" "I'm saying yes," she whispered, stepping closer to him. "Yes to the second Sunday in August. Yes to building this ranch together. Yes to a future I never thought I'd have again." Killian's arms enveloped her, strong and secure, as his lips found hers in a kiss that held both promise and passion. When they finally parted, both were smiling through tears. "I should write to my brother in Colorado," Killian said, his voice rough with emotion. "He's the only family I have left. He should be here. And I'll need to find something suitable to wear," Faith added, suddenly practical despite the joy bubbling inside her. "My black dresses hardly seem appropriate." Killian laughed, the sound warming Faith to her toes. "No, Mrs. Keller, this is a beginning, not an ending, and beginnings deserve fresh colors." In the weeks leading up to their wedding, the ranch flourished under their combined efforts. The lambs grew strong, the garden produced abundantly, and word began to spread about the quality of their merino wool. Several nearby ranchers, who had initially been skeptical about sheep raising, now expressed interest in purchasing breeding stock for the following year. Faith spent her evenings sewing a wedding dress from pale blue cotton fabric that Killian had ridden 2 days to purchase from the nearest proper town. It was a simple design, but the color brought out the blue of her eyes and symbolized the fresh start they were making together. As the second Sunday in August dawned clear and warm, Faith stood before the small mirror in her bedroom, hardly recognizing the woman who looked back at her. Gone was the perpetual shadow of grief that had darkened her features for 3 years. In its place was a quiet joy, a hard-won serenity. She placed Thomas's photograph in the center of her dresser, touching it one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, "for loving me enough to want my happiness, even after you were gone." The ceremony was simple and intimate. Just Faith, Killian, Pastor Miller, Killian's brother James, who had arrived from Colorado the previous day, and 2 neighboring families who had become friends over the summer. They exchanged vows beneath the sprawling oak tree where Thomas was buried, a choice that seemed both fitting and healing to Faith. "I take you, Faith Keller, to be my lawfully wedded wife." Killian's voice rang clear and true in the summer air. "To have and to hold from this day forward, for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death parts us." As Faith repeated the vows, she felt a sense of rightness settle deep in her bones. This wasn't betraying Thomas's memory, it was honoring life's continuing journey, embracing the second chance that had appeared when she least expected it. After the ceremony, they shared a joyful meal in the yard outside the cabin, with tables fashioned from planks and sawhorses decorated with wildflowers. James played the fiddle while one of the neighbor men accompanied on the banjo, and for the first time in years, Faith danced, her blue skirt swirling as Killian guided her with sure hands and a heart full of promises. As evening approached and their guests prepared to depart, James pulled Killian aside for a private word. Faith watched curiously as the brothers spoke intently, Killian's expression shifting from surprise to delight. When James handed Killian a small leather packet, Killian embraced his brother with unusual emotion. Later, as twilight painted the sky in shades of lavender and gold, Faith and Killian stood alone on the porch of what was now truly their home. "What did James give you that made you so happy?" Faith asked, leaning into her new husband's side. Killian reached into his pocket and withdrew the packet, opening it to reveal a significant sum of money. "A wedding gift," he called it. "But it's really an investment in our future. He's been doing well with his freight business in Colorado, better than I realized. This is enough to triple our flock next spring and build proper shelters before winter." Faith stared at the unexpected windfall. "That's incredibly generous." "He says it's partial repayment for the years I looked after him after our parents died," Killian explained, still sounding stunned by his brother's generosity. "But mostly he said he hasn't seen me this happy since before the war, and he wants to make sure we have every chance to succeed." Faith laid her hand over the money, then over Killian's heart. "We would have succeeded anyway," she said with quiet conviction. "But this will certainly make the road easier." As the stars emerged in the darkening sky, Killian led Faith back into the cabin that had witnessed so much of her grief and was now the setting for her newfound joy. A fire crackled in the hearth, and beside it, Faith noticed that Thomas's photograph had been placed on the mantel, still visible, but no longer the central focus of the room. She looked questioningly at Killian, who shrugged slightly. "James put it there while we were saying goodbye to the pastor. He said it seemed like the right place honoring the past, while making space for the future. I hope that's all right." Tears of gratitude welled in Faith's eyes as she wrapped her arms around her husband's neck. "It's perfect." Just like everything else about today. Killian's arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer. "Not everything has been perfect, Faith York," he murmured, using her new name for the first time. "But we're just getting started." Faith smiled against his lips. "Then we'd better make the most of every moment." And as Killian lifted her into his arms to carry her toward their bedroom, Faith cast one last glance at the photograph on the mantel. For a moment, she could almost swear Thomas was smiling his approval. Epilogue, 1876. The autumn sun cast long golden shadows across the valley as Faith stood on the porch, one hand resting on her swollen belly, while the other shaded her eyes. Below her, The expanded ranch spread out in orderly beauty, neat fenced pastures, where nearly 300 merino sheep grazed contentedly. A proper barn with adjacent wool processing shed, fields of alfalfa and Timothy hay harvested and stacked for winter, and a new wing added to the cabin to accommodate their growing family. 5 years had transformed both the ranch and Faith herself. The business they had built together was now known throughout the territory for producing some of the finest wool in Montana, and the York's breeding stock commanded premium prices. The lonely widow struggling to survive had become a confident ranchwoman with a thriving business and a heart full to overflowing. Faith smiled as she spotted Killian in the distance, returning from the south pasture with their 3-year-old daughter, Emma, perched happily on his shoulders. Even from here, she could hear the child's delighted laughter as Killian pretended to be her trusty steed. Watching them, Faith's hand drifted unconsciously to the small silver locket. She always wore a wedding gift from Killian that contained a tiny portion of Thomas's photograph on one side and a family portrait of Faith, Killian, and Emma on the other. Past and present, grief and joy, endings and beginnings, all part of the tapestry of her life. As Killian and Emma neared the house, the little girl spotted her mother and waved enthusiastically. "Mama, Papa let me help with the lambs." "Did he now?" Faith called back, smiling at her daughter's excitement. Killian lifted Emma from his shoulders and set her down, watching fondly as she ran ahead to the porch, her dark hair so like his own, streaming behind her. "And were you a good helper?" Faith asked, bending as much as her pregnancy would allow to embrace her daughter. "The very best," Killian confirmed, climbing the steps to join his family. He pressed a kiss to Faith's temple, then placed a gentle hand on her rounded belly. "How are you feeling today?" "Impatient," Faith admitted with a laugh. "Your son is restless." "My daughter, you mean," Killian corrected with a teasing smile. It had become a running joke between them, this good-natured disagreement about the baby's gender. Emma tugged at her father's hand. "Papa, tell Mama about the surprise." Killian's eyes twinkled with mischief. "What surprise, little one? I don't recall any surprise." Emma stamped her foot in childish frustration. "Papa, you promised we could show her." Faith raised an eyebrow questioningly. "What have you two been plotting?" Killian scooped Emma up with one arm and offered his other to Faith. "Come see for yourself." He led them around to the back of the cabin, where a previously empty patch of ground had been transformed. Neat rows of freshly turned earth were marked with small wooden stakes, and at the center stood a simple wooden bench beneath a newly planted sapling. Faith gasped in delight. "The flower garden I've always wanted?" "Emma and I have been preparing it all week while you napped in the afternoons," Killian explained. "We've ordered bulbs and seeds from back east, tulips, daffodils, roses, all the flowers you mentioned loving from your childhood in Illinois. They'll arrive before the first frost. And Papa made the bench so you can sit and watch them grow," Emma added proudly. "And he said next spring, when the baby can sit up, we can all have picnics here." Tears of joy welled in Faith's eyes as she took in this tangible expression of her husband's love. "It's perfect," she whispered, squeezing his hand. "There's one more thing," Killian said, leading her to the small bench. Carved into the back, in Killian's careful hand, were the words, "From bitter soil, the sweetest blooms may rise." Faith traced the letters with her fingertips, recognizing the line from a poem she had once read to Killian during their courtship, a poem about finding beauty after devastation, hope after despair. "I love you," she said simply, words that had become easier to speak with each passing year, but had never lost their power. Killian's eyes softened as he gazed at his wife, still beautiful to him, perhaps more so for the journey they had traveled together. "And I love you, Faith York, today, tomorrow, and all the days to come." As the setting sun gilded the world in amber light, Faith sat on the bench with Emma nestled against her side and Killian's strong hand in hers, gazing out over the ranch they had built together. In the distance, the small family plot where Thomas rested was visible, the oak tree now adorned with a simple wooden swing for Emma. The past was honored, not forgotten. The present was cherished, not taken for granted. And the future stretched before them, as vast and promising as the Montana sky. Faith smiled, feeling the baby shift beneath her heart, another beginning in a life that had taught her that endings, even the most painful ones, were not forever.